Liberal leader Mark Carney has vowed to continue public access to gender-affirming care such as puberty blockers, quote, without exception.
Liberal candidate Peter Yuen deflected questions regarding his ties to pro-Beijing organizations.
A Liberal MP who was stripped of his license to practice law was an early advocate of the Liberal government's catch-and-release justice reform laws. Hello Canada, it's Friday, April 11th, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Cosmin, Dzsurdzsa.
And I'm Geoff Knight.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. In a continuation of policies set by his predecessor, former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Liberal leader Mark Carney has vowed to maintain government-funded access to puberty blockers and transgender surgeries. During a press conference in Alberta on Tuesday, Carney made sweeping promises to defend gender-affirming care. Gender-affirming care is a common term used by transgender activists to refer to publicly funded access to puberty blockers, hormone treatment, sex change operations, and other medical or non-medical interventions to accommodate an individual's chosen gender identity. In response to a question on the issue, Carney said that, quote, access to healthcare is a fundamental right. Reporters asked Carney whether the Liberals would intervene to protect access to transgender medical treatments under the Canada Health Act, a move that could further violate provincial jurisdictions as provinces like Alberta seek to prevent access to controversial treatments like puberty blockers for minors.
Your platform hasn't said anything about LGBTQ Canadians. We're here in Alberta where the province wants to restrict healthcare for transgender people, and they want the Canada Health Act to defend their access to gender-affirming care. Would you do that? And what is your party going to do about the backsliding that we're seeing for gender and sexual minorities?
Thank you for the question, Dylan. Let me start at a fundamental point, which is, our Canada is a mosaic. We are all Canadians, but we all have different identities and distinctions. And one of the great strengths of this country is recognizing that people can be who they are, they can love who they love, they can live where they want to live. And it's fundamentally important that the federal government is the defender of those rights, defender of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And access to health care in Canada is not a business, it is a fundamental right, and we will defend it. For all Canadians without exception.
Alberta's policies such as Bill 26, quote, prohibits health professionals from performing sex reassignment surgeries on minors, as well as the use of puberty blockers by minors except for those 16 and 17 with parental approval. So, Geoff, I know that healthcare is technically a provincial jurisdiction, but that hasn't stopped the federal government from weighing in or attempting to fund groups that push certain agendas, especially the gender ideology agenda. But at the federal level, how much are taxpayers being billed to fund gender-affirming care, and what sort of programs exist in Ottawa?
Taxpayers are footing a pretty significant bill for gender-affirming care at the federal level, particularly through programs like the Public Service Healthcare Plan, which Mark Carney's policies seem intent on expanding. According to a CBC report from August of last year, the PSHCP, covering federal public servants, retirees, and their dependents, saw $1.1 million in claims for gender-affirming care in the 2023-2024 fiscal year alone. That's a sharp jump from $664,000 in the previous year, a 65% increase, driven by a spike in demand for procedures like genital and chest surgeries, as well as hormone treatments. The plan, which started covering these treatments in 2022, now includes up to $75,000 per person for gender-affirming surgeries not covered by provincial health plans, plus an additional $10,000 every 2 years for other procedures like facial surgeries. With 615,000 members enrolled, the costs are only climbing. Sun Life, the plan's administrator, paid out $4,000 per claimant on average in 2023 to 24, up from $2,900 the year before. That's millions straight from the taxpayers' pockets, and Carney's pledge to double down on this suggests that numbers could balloon even further. especially if the Liberals push to override provincial restrictions like Alberta's. It's a hefty price tag for a program that's already growing fast. Liberal candidate for Markham-Unionville, Peter Yuen, has deflected questions about his past affiliations with pro-China organizations. The Liberals handpicked the former Toronto deputy police chief to replace disgraced Liberal MP Paul Chang as their candidate in the riding after Chang called for a Conservative opponent to be kidnapped and turned into China for a bounty. Yuen's connections to Beijing-linked organizations like the Jiangsu Commerce Council of Canada and his participation in pro-CCP events have risen to the forefront. The Liberal candidate's past advocacy arrives on the backdrop of an ongoing foreign interference campaign by Chinese state-affiliated media, boosting rock star Carney to the Chinese diaspora in Canada, as revealed by the security and intelligence threats to Elections Task Force. In a statement to the Globe and Mail, Yuen defended his record. He wrote, quote, "I have built a great career committed to public service and have a track record of maintaining the health, safety, and well-being of those in our community as Toronto's former deputy police chief. I am ready to build a stronger community for the people of Markham-Unionville." Carney's choice of Yuen, who has attended events organized by pro-Beijing groups and was even videotaped singing a communist Chinese anthem, has raised concerns among Chinese dissidents and political observers. Yuen has spoken at events hosted by the Toronto branch of the Chinese Freemasons, an organization that actively advocates for the annexation of Taiwan by China, in line with the CCP's One China policy. While Yuen now claims his role with the Commerce Council ended a decade ago, he has not directly addressed whether he supports Taiwan's self-determination, nor Hong Kong or Tibet, and he has never publicly condemned China's human rights abuses against religious and ethnic minority groups. Adding to the controversy, Yuen was also a board member of NOIC Academy, a private school flagged by intelligence officials for election interference. Canadian intelligence agencies have raised concerns that students at the school were threatened by the Chinese consulate into voting for preferred candidates. So, Cosmin, we know of Beijing's past attempts to interfere in Canadian democracy. Should Canadians be concerned that China is attempting to influence this federal election?
Well, absolutely. I don't think China has given up on election interference when it comes to Canadian democracy. They did it in 2019. They did it in 2021. They've been doing it for a while, and this is only at the federal level. There hasn't really been any investigation at the provincial or municipal level. But the latest concern is the fact that we have a prime candidate, potentially the next Prime Minister of Canada, Liberal leader Mark Carney, being flagged by Canada's election interference watchdog as a primary target of favorable coverage by a Chinese state-backed media operation. And that came from the SITE task force, which has been charged with maintaining the security and integrity of Canadian elections due to past foreign interference, like we saw in 2019 and 2021, as I mentioned. But they essentially unveiled a campaign on the popular Chinese messaging platform WeChat being pushed by a state-backed media outlet to Chinese diaspora in Canada. And this campaign was essentially, when you actually look at the sorts of articles and coverage they were promoting, it all presents Mark Carney as the preferred candidate to vote for. They talk about his qualification, as a former central banker, governor of the Bank of Canada, Bank of England. They call him a rock star economist, and I quote that directly. They also play him up as the person to fight U.S. President Donald Trump. And we know in past elections there's been attempts by China to downplay and even thwart the election of conservative candidates, and that includes in the latest election in 2021. So it's quite obvious, and Mark Carney, his own responses to these, what essentially amounts to election interference, hasn't been stellar, right? He's sort of brushed it off. He said, I had no idea. But he's refused to condemn it and essentially take a stronger stance. So absolutely, election interference continues to be at play this election. A Liberal MP and incumbent candidate in British Columbia's Surrey Central riding, who had his license to practice law suspended for professional misconduct, also championed a soft-on-crime law that many attributed to rising crime rates in his constituency. Randeep Sarai, Liberal MP incumbent candidate for Surrey Centre, was an avowed supporter of Bill C-5, which repealed certain mandatory minimum penalties for criminal offenses. Bill C-5, which received royal assent in November 2022, was designed to address systemic racism and discrimination within the criminal justice system by eliminating mandatory minimum sentences for various criminal offenses, mostly gun crimes and drug possession. The government's backgrounder on Bill C-5 says there is, quote, systemic racism in Canada's criminal justice system, which the new legislation attempted to solve. Sarai was an early champion and proponent of the law, which has been cited by many critics, including Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, as a contributing factor to Canada's catch-and-release legal system and a subsequent crime wave in recent years. Sarai said at the time, quote, a criminal justice system which utilizes a mandatory minimum penalty as a model of reform is not reflective of Canadian values or the needs of racialized and marginalized communities within Canada. Instead of reducing systemic racism, however, the law has led to a series of incidents in which offenders were arrested and charged, released, and then arrested and charged again shortly thereafter for committing the same or similar offenses. A recent case of repeat offenders being released prematurely includes David William Charles Hoffman, a prolific violent reoffender who is facing charges of assault, attempted robbery, breaking and entering, and mischief in relation to a violent incident at a Surrey modular home park. At the time of his alleged offenses, Hoffman already had an extensive criminal history with over a dozen charges and convictions and had been released on bail only weeks earlier. Out of all of the things the Liberals have been campaigning on, their record on crime doesn't seem to be one that's at the forefront. Geoff, has Mark Carney taken the issue of crime seriously, and what are his crime policies so far that he's proposed this election?
Yeah, Cosmin, Mark Carney has talked about tackling crime, but his approach so far feels more like a series of promises rather than a serious crackdown, especially when you look at the fallout from policies like Bill C-5 that his party pushed. On April 10th, the Liberal Party released a plan to fight crime, protect Canadians, and build safer communities, as outlined on their website. Carney's big pitch is to go after criminal gangs and stop illegal guns and drugs from crossing the U.S. border. He's promised to disrupt and dismantle criminal networks and bolster the justice system, but the details are light on how he'll actually do that. More concretely, he's committed to protecting kids from online crimes like sextortion by introducing new legislation, and he's also vowed to fight rising hate crimes by increasing funding to the Canadian Community Security Program. That includes making it a criminal offense to obstruct access to places of worship, schools, or community centers, or to intimidate people at those locations. These are targeted measures, for sure, but they don't directly address the kind of repeat offender issues we're seeing in places like Surrey, with cases like David Hoffman. Carney's rhetoric leans heavily on safety and security, with him saying, quote, we will protect community spaces so that Canadians can live their lives in safety and security. But there's a disconnect here. His party's track record, including their support for Bill C-5, has been blamed for fueling catch-and-release cycles that let repeat offenders like Hoffman back on the streets. Carney hasn't signaled any rollback of these softer policies, which undercuts his tough-on-crime messaging. His plan focuses more on prevention and community protection than on addressing the systemic issues in the justice system that critics like Pierre Poilievre argue are driving crime waves.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.